It is a gloomy day here in Texas, but I'm gonna tell you, I'm actually in a good mood because I'm excited to work on this bed set. It is for my daughter's room. If you saw a few projects back, I worked on an antique Eastlake dresser for her room, and this is kind of the part B to some updates I'm doing to her room. She's gotten a little bit older. I love Jenny Lynn type antique frames, and I was able to score this for only $50 locally. Did have to drive 30 minutes to get it, but it has the metal connecting frames. I will have to make some slats for support for it, but shouldn't be too bad of a project. I am going to paint this. Hopefully it doesn't hurt your feelings too much that I'm going to, but the thought of stripping all this down, all these little spindles, it's just more work than I want. And I think white will be really timeless look still. So yes, spoiler alert, I am painting it white. That might make you even more mad if you don't like painted furniture. But I think it's going to look great in her room, and you'll get a nice after shot of what it looks like with that dresser I did and with some new bedding I got her. So I'm excited. Let's get to it.
I figured the best way to work would be with the bed fully assembled, so I went ahead and attached the rails. You'll also see me moving a beautiful Drexel buffet out of the way, and that will be featured in my next video. This thing was quite dirty, just even when I picked it up at first, and then being in my garage for a couple months and picking up dust and overspray. So I filled a bucket with Dawn dish soap and water and gave it a really good scrub down. And then followed that up with just some clean water to rinse it all off.
So now it's time to scuff sand. A majority of my time, I'm going to be using my Surf Prep sander. What's really nice is that they have these squishy Proform pads. I am using a medium grit, and this one is it's not quite as soft as some of their other ones. Like I have one that's super squishy, but it'll still work at like scuff sanding. But there are a lot of places I can tell that are just uneven. I don't know, with whatever last stain application was done to this, it's just not very smooth, and I don't want that showing up when I paint. So I am going to use this one that's going to take off a little bit more as I sand. I will need to make sure that I am not taking off any of the actual shape as I go. So it's always something that you want to watch.
Unfortunately, my mic died around here, but I was just explaining that the speed on this is adjustable, so you can always start out at a slower speed, see how that's doing, and then maybe take it up a notch, and if that starts to take off too much, go back to your lower speed. How I mostly ended up sanding the bed frame was the areas that you see there on the top that are a bit larger. I was able to use the firmer pad, and then for those like spindles that were had a bit more contour to them, I use the squishier pad. And I'm so bad at keeping track of how long these projects take me, but I would say I spent probably a good couple of hours sanding. I use mostly my Surf Prep sander, like I said, and then on the flat areas, I was able to use my orbital sander, which was nice. I did still have to come in and hand sand in some areas, but I had some contour sanding pads that I used that were helpful, or I just used my hands in areas that I wanted to make sure that I sanded well, because the important part of sanding here is that you want to give a good surface for your paint to adhere to. After sanding, there's usually still quite a bit of dust left on the surface, so I like to give it a good vacuum and then a wipe down with a rag and or tack cloth, depending on how dirty I felt like it was. Okay, all of the scuff sanding, wiping, cleaning, etc. is finished. Now it is time to prime. As you can see, I have a new spray booth that I've created. Lisa from Ivy Lane Home has a similar setup, and ever since I saw it, I was like, I need to replicate that in my garage. So I finally did that today, since you'll have such a large piece to spray. I just thought it would be good to go ahead and get that set up. And so it's set up, and I'm really excited about it. So for my primer, I'm using Sherwin-Williams Probot primer. It's good for sealing in with this dark mahogany that's gonna probably want to bleed on me, and I'm painting it white, so I want to get that covered as well as I can. I'm gonna get to spraying, and This will set overnight, and I'll probably do at least 2 coats, just depending on how it looks as I go. It was kind of funny. I was a little perplexed at times about how to tackle spraying this without there being too much overlap and causing drips. Obviously the top, it was pretty easy to do, but then as I'm going on the underside and then trying to get the vertical areas, I kind of second guessed myself as I went along, but I finally got a groove to it. I will add that I probably was holding the spray canister a little too close. I did have some areas that were dripping, and it maybe went on a little bit too heavy. And you could see I start going a little bit faster here, and I think that change in technique helped a lot. And please make sure you use proper PPE when using spray paint. This stuff is very fumey. I even had to press on my respirator a bit because I could still smell the fumes at times through my respirator, and I did not want to be breathing that in. Unfortunately, there were a lot of areas where the paint splattered as it was spraying out of the can. I've not had to do that before. I mean, it's all here too. The other side's a little bit better, but I'm gonna have to sand that down and get it smooth before I do my next coat of primer. Since there was so much texture, I opted to use my sander versus hand sanding because hand sanding would have just taken forever. I'm using the squishy pads with a fine grit. I also set the speed setting at the lowest. I chose this because I felt like it would take off the least amount of the primer, but also get it really good and smooth. And this approach thankfully worked really well. It did take off a bit more of the primer than I would have liked in some areas, but to me it was worth it because of the time I saved. On the front here, I had some pretty major drips, and I hand sanded these down back to flat. I'm using 220 grit. You can see I'll sand a little bit, then run my finger over it to make sure it's smooth, and if it is good, then I'll move on to another section. For my next round of primer, I switched to Zinsser Cover Stain. It's another oil-based primer that covers really well. I just didn't like how that other one was splattering on me, which I hadn't had that happen to me before, but I didn't want to mess with sanding it back like that again, so I used this one and it worked really well, but I of course went a bit lighter on my coverage. This coat went on much better, but there are some dark spots still, so I'm going to do one more round of primer since I'm going with a light color after I give it a good sand. To hand sand, I'm using this 400 grit sanding sponge. I really like these sanding sponges. It comes in a multi-pack, and it starts, I believe, at 400 grit and then goes up to like all the way to 2000 grit. So these are really great for doing some really ultra fine sanding to get it extra smooth for the final coats. And then I love how pliable it is to get around all these corners and nooks. And then it was time for the last coat of primer. For the paint, I'm actually using some leftover paint I had from a project a few years ago. It's Benjamin Moore Advanced Paint. It's in the color Chantilly Lace, which is a nice white, which I felt would go well with the rest of her room. And this right here is why it's always a good idea to do some test sprays. I had the flow fully open and the air blowing pretty hard, and it was still splattering on me. So I had to go back and thin down my paint some more, and it was finally spraying well. So usually when I am painting a dresser or nightstand, I'm usually thinking about overlapping my spray pattern and all those things. But with this bed frame, I'm having to think about getting good coverage while also not putting too much product on there because it could run into problems with drips. And here you can see how it looks after I'm finished spraying. It has that smooth, glossy look that I was hoping for. Unfortunately, when it dried, I found several areas that had drip marks, so I had to fix that with one of my sanding sponges. I used a fine grit, and it was pretty easy to sand back, thankfully, but still something I would have liked to have not had to do. I then finished up with a light sanding all over before applying the second coat of paint. Now it was time to head to Lowe's to get the supplies to make the slats. I first picked up a staple gun and then the staples that I needed because my plan is to make a system. So I'm not just having the boards all across the bottom separately, but they will all be connected by a long strip of fabric that I will staple to the boards. Connecting them obviously isn't necessary, but it's just something that I've had on some other beds that my kids have been in, and I've liked having all the slats connected. Here I'm just checking the boards to make sure that they're straight. It's not too important on this project that they're perfectly straight, but I don't want anything really curved. And I just picked up some 1x3 whitewood boards. Now, of course, before I get to cutting, I need to measure to make sure that I have the right length to cut it. Thankfully, there is some wiggle room with how it's going to rest on each side of the railing, so you have some room to work there, but I just went ahead and cut my first piece, made sure that it fit, and then I could use it as a template to mark where to cut on the other pieces. To make sure that I was spacing these boards evenly apart on each side, I used a scrap 2x2 piece of wood, which is really just 1.5 by 1.5. And that way I was having even spacing between each board, and I didn't cut enough spacers obviously to go all the way down because that would have just taken a lot of time and I feel like kind of been wasteful. So I just had about 4 on each side and I would move them as I needed more. Then it was time to figure out my new stapler. It was really straightforward. Honestly, didn't look at the directions, but you can see I'm pointing to the stapler says T50 and then the box of staples says T50. I don't really know what that means, but I'm sure it's a certain type of staple. It just has this little release button at the bottom that you can open it with, and then you insert the staples. I was a dummy and first inserted the staples the wrong way. You can see like the pointed side is going into the staple gun. It would not shut, so I quickly figured out that was the wrong way and switched it around and turned the power on and got to going. Oh, and I did charge it before bringing it out. I'm putting it in wrong. There we go. So now that I have these all spaced out, my plan is to use the staple gun to attach this ribbon. It's a canvas type ribbon to it, along the sides all the way down. So then whenever I'm transporting it somewhere, or if I had to take it apart or anything like that, you just, like, all the wood kind of scoops up together and stays attached. So it's a lot easier to transport. So hopefully this will be pretty straightforward. I've never used a staple gun before, but it doesn't seem like it would be too hard. So we'll see. Okay, my oldest daughter's out here and she suggested double stapling it, so I'm going to try that. For whatever reason, my phone was not picking up the sound of the stapler when it was releasing the staple, but it does make a noise, so it's coming out. But it is nice that it's not super loud. Okay, it's fully assembled, so let's put it to the test. See how nice this is to just be able to pick it up. It's heavy though. That might be fun for me. But it's a really nice system to have. So there we go. Let's go get it upstairs. And this is just a shot of real life. Her mattress has been on the floor for almost 3 months. Christmas tree is still up 2 weeks after Christmas, but it took less than 10 minutes to get the mattress up out of the way and get the area cleaned up some. And then it was time to make the several trips up and down the stairs to bring everything up and get it assembled. And then once I got the slats on, my oldest daughter helped me put the mattress on there and we gave it a quick test, and it was great. Now, before the full reveal, let's take a quick look back at the bed frame before I updated it. It was dirty from hanging out in my garage, but you can see the nicks and dings from over the years. But here it is updated in her room now. I love how it turned out. This is just how I'd hope it would look. I like the white. I feel like it's a good classic color for this style. And it pairs really well with the design in her room already. And of course, the dresser I did a couple months ago. It just all looks so good together. So I'm really pleased with these updates and that I was able to do them in a much more cost-effective way than buying new. And if you're curious, here's the breakdown of the cost of everything I used. Now, I did try to record her reaction when she first saw her room, but she was a little camera shy, so this is what I got, and that's okay. Thank you again, as always, for watching. I hope you enjoyed this makeover, and I hope you stick around for my next video when I am going to be making over this beautiful Drexel buffet, and I am so ecstatic with how it turned out.